Okay, why don't we start? And let's start with a brief survey. Not a quiz, just a survey. Assuming you went to sleep last night, how many of you remember having a dream? Okay. Actually remember having a dream? All right. How many remember having just one dream? Just one. 2? 3? 4? 5? Okay, now take another minute, and whatever you're writing on or writing in, write out a little couple of sentences describing the one dream you really remember well. You're not going to turn this in. Just do it. Okay. All right. If you're like most people, you remember having at least one dream from the night before. If you're like most people, the dream that you remember is the one you awakened in the morning dreaming. Okay. And if you're like most people, you don't remember very much about that dream. Okay. So what you've got there are three interesting phenomena of consciousness. One is that we dream while we're asleep. Second is that we actually have a number of dreams while we're asleep, usually. Third, we awaken out of a dream. And fourth, as the day goes on, memory for that dream gets pretty rotten, pretty bad, pretty fast. Okay? So these are just illustrations of some of the aspects of consciousness during sleep, which is interesting because when philosophers and other people are pressed to define consciousness, instead of talking about qualia and subjectivity and intentionality and all of that other philosophical stuff, what you'll often get from somebody is consciousness is that thing you've got from the time you wake up in the morning until the time you go to sleep at night. Okay? The implication being that from the time you go to sleep at night until the time you wake up in the morning, you're not conscious, okay? Because consciousness is the thing you've got during those waking hours. It's that idea that lies behind this consensual identification of consciousness with wakefulness that we talked about last time. Before I go on, let me just say that you're going to get 2 days on sleep and dreams from me, but if you're really interested in this topic, there are other courses around the university where you can get a lot more material. First, in the psychology department, we have this wonderful course, Psychology 133, co-taught by Dr. Allison Harvey, who's a clinical psychologist, and Dr. Matt Walker, who's a neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist, interested in different aspects of sleep, but they jointly run a sleep laboratory over in Tolman Hall and teach this course, which is offered about every other year, I think. Second, Professor Eleanor Rosh has in the past taught a very highly regarded course devoted to dreams, not sleep, but dreams. Rosh is now retired, but from time to time, retired faculty are called back to teach very popular courses. And I think popular demand might work in this case as well. Okay, let's talk for a moment about why people, psychologists and other cognitive scientists, might be interested in sleep. First of all, there's the puzzle of the function of sleep. It's not at all clear what good sleep does to people. You might say intuitively, well, sleep has a kind of restorative function. You tire yourself out during the day, and sleep restores various aspects of bodily functioning. But it turns out that that's very hard to pin down. People can go for a fairly long time without sleep, without suffering very many performance deficits. Some people can get by with very little sleep. Winston Churchill famously, at least by his own account, slept only about 2 hours a night during the entirety of World War II, 6 years, and seems to have done pretty well. He did, after all, win the war. Sleep also is alleged to play, it not only is alleged, sleep seems to play a role in learning and memory. Professor Walker, in particular, has been among the leaders of those studying the role of various aspects of sleep in the consolidation of memories from the previous night. We're not going to talk much about that. We're not going to talk anything at all about that in this class because there are other aspects of consciousness I want to talk about. And then finally, sleep disorders are a major health problem for healthcare. Large numbers of people have problems sleeping, either problems getting to sleep, problems staying asleep. Some people wake up too early. There are all sorts of other sleep disorders. And sleep medicine is now a major component in the healthcare industry. You can't swing a cat in a hospital anymore without finding a sleep laboratory devoted mostly to the diagnosis and treatment of various kinds of sleep disorders. But as that philosophical response implies, the consciousness is that thing you have from the time you wake up in the morning till the time you go to sleep at night. In this course, sleep is interesting mostly because it seems to represent a lapse in consciousness, that whatever else happens, whatever else sleep does, sleep causes us to be unconscious in a way that we weren't conscious before we went to sleep. You see references in the literature, for example, to dreamless sleeps, acknowledging that dreams occur during sleep, and maybe people are conscious while they're dreaming, but there are other times during sleep when they're not even doing that. So that's one reason why sleep is interesting. For pretty much the same reason, coma and anesthesia are interesting, because they seem to represent the loss of this thing that we're particularly interested in. As I'll talk about on Wednesday, there's also a question of consciousness in dreams. We know that we have several dreams per night. Every reason to suspect that we have several dreams per night, but it's not at all clear what it means to know that you're dreaming, to be aware that you're dreaming, to remember that you're dreaming. There are also questions about the extent to which, if we really are unconscious during sleep, how much information processing can occur unconsciously while we're asleep. And then finally, sleep and dreams especially can help us to address aspects of the mind-body problem, especially the problem of the neural correlates of sleep. If, by virtue of going to sleep, we lose consciousness, then you'd expect to see some kind of radical change, say in neurophysiology, between the times when we're asleep and the times when we're awake. So besides its function in learning and memory, despite its, say, biological adaptiveness or whatever, there are reasons for people who are interested in consciousness to be interested in sleep and dreams. So how do you know when you're asleep? Or how do you know that somebody else is asleep? Well, there are certain kinds of signs that tend to go along with being asleep. Some of these are overt behavioral signs. Usually when people fall asleep, they seem to be quite relaxed. They're usually in a prone posture, though my spouse tells me I once fell asleep standing up in a museum. Sleeping people usually display very slow, even kind of breathing. And then there are subjective experiences that are also associated with being asleep. We usually experience sleep as an interruption of consciousness. If you're watching television or a movie or you're at a concert or whatever and you happen to fall asleep, you realize when you wake up that you've missed something, okay? Very often when people awaken, especially out of certain stages of sleep, they're disoriented. They don't quite know what's been going on or where they are. There is a failure of memory. You realize that there are things that have been happening, like somebody talking to you, that you don't have any memory for at all. And you also recognize that you've been asleep when you remember having some kind of dream. You don't remember anything else, but you remember dragons on bicycles chasing you down the Champs-Élysées or something, and you say, that must have been a dream. So just in terms of overt behavior and subjective experience, we have ways that are fairly reliable of telling whether somebody is asleep or not. And we also have physiological measures that can tell us when we're asleep. And the kinds of measures that are taken in what's known as polysomnography, som, sleep, graphy, writing or record, and poly, lots of different indices. This is a very, very simplified depiction of what this looks like, so that at a very minimum, we collect EOG, electrooculogram, measures of eye movements from the right and the left eye. And there is also, in the very simplest kind of setup, recording of EEG. In very simple setups, there's just one electrode, so there's only one channel of EEG being recorded. In the kinds of laboratories that Professor Harvey and Professor Walker and their students, including Adam, work in. Adam won't recognize this diagram because they have 24, 26, 256 electrodes on people's heads. And then down here, there's usually an EMG electrode to measure tension in the jaw. Primary the emphasis here is going to be on what we learn from the electroencephalogram, from the EEG record. And again, it's important to know that in the EEG, although the EEG may look like a single signal, in fact, it can be decomposed through various mathematical techniques into the series of bands that make up what's known as the EEG spectrum. In sleep research, there are 3 of these bands that are particularly important. Alpha activity, which is relatively high amplitude, high voltage, moderate frequency, 8 to 12 cycles per second activity. I'll show you what this looks like in a second. Beta activity, which is much higher frequency, say 18 to 30 or so cycles per second, but low amplitude, low voltage activity. And then there's delta activity, which is very slow and also very high amplitude. As I mentioned last time, in the context of anesthesia and coma, there are lots of other bands in the EEG spectrum, but for sleep research, we're talking principally about alpha, beta, and delta activity. So the waking EEG looks kind of sort of like this up at the top. What you'll see here is a mix of activity representing 2 bands of EEG activity, alpha activity and beta activity. Alpha activity is relatively low, 8 to 12, 8 to 15 cycles per second. Beta activity is relatively fast activity, say about 18 to 35 cycles per second. But what you see here is not only is the alpha activity slow and high amplitude, it's also quite rhythmic. And alpha activity shows an interesting pattern